This surely is the best Mordheim board I've ever built. A controversial thought might be to go even as far as calling it the best Mordheim board I've ever seen. I know what you're thinking, but Leif, it is flat. Yes, therein lies its brilliance, but if that wasn't enough, it's also highly modular, fully rotatable, and deceptively simple to make. In this video, I'll walk you through the thinking behind its design, some new techniques I've discovered, and why form truly follows function. Hi good folks, my name is Leif and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel called Devs and Dice, where I paint miniatures or craft awesome terrain for the tabletop. Today I'm going to walk you through the process of creating my new Mordheim board. I'm going to show you the materials and the techniques I use to finish this, and I'm sure some of these will be a little bit new for you. Before we get into it, if you like the channel and the content I make, then please do what you can by hitting the like button, sharing this video, or subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much. My material of choice was OSB boards. The main reason was that the material is cheap and easily accessible at most hardware stores. The dimensions of the two identical pieces is about 2 × 4 feet, or more specifically, exactly 60 × 120 centimeters. Usually, if you lack the means, the hardware store will cut them to shape for you if you ask nicely. The thickness of the boards is only 1 centimeter, which makes the weight light and manageable. The first real step was to start drilling holes for magnets. Drilling the holes can be somewhat tricky, but just mark out where you want the magnets on both sides to align them. In addition, I made a small jig which ensured that the magnets would be in the same height. To attach these magnets, my weapon of choice was construction adhesive. This is super strong and flexes, which ensures a good bond with the materials. I wondered how I could make this flat landscape look interesting in a way that didn't hinder function. One idea I have been toying around with was to make bespoke cobblestone patterns. I started out with making some designs in Illustrator. The end result was Sigmar's hammer, a shield with a cross, a fish as it is the symbol of Mordheim, an empire emblem with a skull, a twin-tailed comet, and finally a star, simply because it looked kinda cool. I wanted the designs to be the ones that were important to the people of Mordheim. This would help to make it visually much more interesting and also a neat way to potentially tell some story of Mordheim, the old world, and the Empire. My first plan was to hand cut each and every stone. It was in this process I remembered that I do have a laser cutter and engraver. It took a few attempts and some experimentation with speed and power, but eventually I had something that worked. For this to be as simple as possible, I had to engrave the negative space in my designs. Some XPS foam artifacts were left between the cobblestones, but I knew this would be covered in the end, so I went along with this solution. I think these are great. They're a nod to the lore, and when covered with terrain, they vanish, but leave them exposed, and you got instant atmosphere and story. I wanted to be able to rotate my board freely. This would help a lot with accessibility when playing Mordheim, since my hobby space is quite cramped. But in addition, it would also enable me to shoot smooth pans across the board for glamour shots or potential battle reports. I guess the lesson here is, sometimes if you can't move, you move the world around you. My idea was quite simple. I would use another thicker piece of OSB board, have a Lazy Susan underneath it, and add my Mordheim boards on top of it. The reason I made these rails on the bottom board was simply to ensure that the Mordheim boards don't fly out. I realized afterwards that this enlarged nullified the installed magnets, as they would not be needed anymore. Well, one learns something new every time for sure. One issue that bothered me was whether or not the bottom board would be centered around the Lazy Susan.
In order to fix this, I took some measurements and cut out some round shapes that would enable the lazy Susan to slot in securely and keep up with my rotating shenanigans. Of course, another benefit of this was the oncoming bricking from hell. It would be a lot easier. I hoped. So I needed to start worrying about the cobblestones, which meant of course that it was time to make a lot of small XPS foam stones. Now for this one I decided to forego the typical 10x5x5mm and instead went with 5x5x5mm sizes. For getting some basic texturing on the stones, I opted for the also famous tumbling them around with some rocks inside a container method. This method works nicely to give each stone a nice rounded edge. Once I had my small XPS stones made, it was time to start the grueling process of gluing them in. Like a fool that doesn't listen to my own advice, I started gluing the edge stones using tacky glue. However, I wised up and used hot glue to ensure I had a barrier to work within. It was at this point I remembered to start gluing in some of the manholes. Pretty sure these were some that were left behind from the old Mordheim board, and I think they Victus are the sculptors that made the manholes I used. People call me insane when they found out my plans of bricking a 4x4 foot area with 5mm cobblestones. Well, I agree, but I had a plan. The whole thing comes from embracing the chaotic nature of a cobblestone placement. Have you ever worked with wall filler or spackle? Well, the idea came from there. Since my cobblestones were uniform in every direction, I didn't really care which orientation they had. Using a large brush, plenty of white hobby glue, and water, I could almost spackle in the cobblestones. Since I was using white hobby glue, I could easily set the cobblestones down on the board and then adjust them using the white brush. Little by little, I got one area done after the other. Since the laser cut design and the barriers were already fixed in place, they worked well to ensure that I had something to move these cobblestones onto. And once everything had dried, I scrunched up some aluminium sheets to a ball and rolled this across the board for some additional texture. When it came to the painting, this was way too much area to use a primer, so instead I opted for some cheap black craft paint. I thinned this down using water and thinner to enable me to get into every nook and cranny. Once the board was black, I airbrushed on some Golden Acrylics High Flow Titanium White, but for some reason my camera did not record this, so bam! There we go. The next step was to cover the entire board with some transparent burnt umber through the airbrush. In this step, it doesn't matter if the result looks a bit patchy. If anything, it's better, since the brown is supposed to represent the dirt and grime. The next paint in line was some dark grey craft paint, which I stipple in here and there. Next was to use some Army Painter Warpaints Fanatics, specifically Dusty Skull and Great Hall Grey. These would be used on the bespoke laser-cut cobblestone patterns. Some gunmetal paint was used on the manhole gratings, and at this point I came in with some light grey craft paint, which I dry brushed over everything. Once everything had dried, I created a sort of save point by airbrushing on some matte varnish for the next step. Now, Swedish summers are shifty. One second it's sunny, then windy and potential rain on the horizon. I had to move fast. I used some ground up coconut fiber and basically spread it all over the board, making sure to get in between all of the cobblestones. Once I was happy, I locked everything in place by spraying a whole lot of homemade sealant. This consisted of a mix of matte Mod Podge, water, and a drop of dish detergent. Eventually, when everything had dried properly, I came in with the secret sauce. Some Army Painter Strong Tone and Airbrush Medium. This I spray here and there to increase the feeling of dirt and grime. I focus especially on and around the manhole gratings, as they would naturally be more moist and humid. I mixed up some Flowade and True Blood to shoot here and there on the board as a memory of the many deaths in the City of the Damned. This time around, I wanted the edges of my board to look nice and provide some protection from bumps and such. The solution was to install some 3mm frame around the two separate Mordheim boards. I used some wood glue and nails to secure the frame properly. The frames were primed black, but I also painted on a separate coat of black paint to give them a proper finish. Some Typhus Corrosion, Ryza Rust and Lead Belcher were painted as a final pass on the manhole gratings. As a small final detail, I added some of my posters here and there, scrunched them up and made them look proper grimdark. Thanks to my patrons for beloved support. Here's to my champion and legend level patrons: Agresomnia, Andreas Winberg, Arjen Angenent, Fredrik Kierskad Lund, Gunnar Byström, Henrik Mannerstråle, Hunters Cave, Madners, Magnus Solberg, Teddy, Anton Hand, Battle Corgi the 7th, Niklas Swedenlind, Oliver Granlund, and the Elder Kind. Well, here it is in all of its glory, my fully rotatable and highly functional Mordheim board. It is like a glorious canvas, just waiting for some grimdark adventures in a perilous world. But what does it look like with terrain, you might ask? Well, here goes. I'm happy to say that my board now supports all of the Mordheim scenarios. Some were especially tricky for me to adhere to with the previous board, such as making an interesting and winding street for Street Fight. But as you can see, it works perfectly fine here, and there are plenty of nooks and crannies for our minis to hide behind. Defend Defined is another scenario which needs an interesting building placed in the center of a board. Well, thankfully, that is not a problem anymore. Another version of that scenario is Occupy, where 3 buildings needs to be placed in the center of a battlefield. Works like a charm. Using some modular bridges, you can easily make this a network of interesting paths and sightlines. Adding some Weirdstone tokens makes this a good layout for scenarios like Weirdstone Hunt, where the warbands are fighting for a maximum of 4 Weirdstones in the ruins of Mordheim. The Hidden Treasure scenario works as a charm as well. My good friend Donnie from Dice Chatter swung by for a quick game where he kicked my butt in a street fight. I was a gracious host and offered him some Swedish princess cake as a reward. Thankfully, he enjoyed it a lot. Well, that's all folks. I hope to see you in the next video.